Sure thing, Alexandra. Thank you, everyone. So welcome to the systemic oppression portion of today's workshop slash training. For the next hour and some change, an hour and 15 minutes, I'm going to be moving us through a number of different topics pertaining to systemic oppression, really with an eye on how those things contribute to homelessness and how they impact us in our communities. So I'm going to now share my screen and hop into the presentation. As Alexandra Appleton said, I am Joshua Bates. I am the Interim Deputy Director at the Joint Office of Homeless Services, as well as the Equity Manager. And I use he, him, and his pronouns. So I always like to start my presentations with a quote, because very oftentimes folks have said things that are far more profound than I have said them, and actually capture the essence of like what I'm trying to get at. So there was this quote that I recently came upon, and I've heard it before, that not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. And I think that really kind of gets at the essence of this conversation that we're going to have today. Because there's this elephant in the room, right? There's this elephant in the room that must be faced. We must acknowledge it. And that is that systemic oppression, that racism is not some abstract thing that is indicative of generations past, right? It's not something that we've moved past as a society. It's not some abstract thing that we can just like look at in a textbook, but that isn't impacting us. It's alive. It is alive and well, and it is impacting us each and every day. It's impacting the systems that we're part of each and every day, and it impacts all interactions, and it's an ever-present part of our lives here in the United States. Racism is real, and it is the crux of what I will be talking about today. So before really hopping into this presentation, I wanted to give a trigger warning. And today I will be talking about racism and violence, and about the history of racism and violence here in Oregon and across this country. There isn't a way to talk about racism without acknowledging the oppressive and racist ways oppressive and violent ways that it has impacted Black, Brown, and Indigenous folks especially. Violence is foundational to racism in this country. And in order to talk about racism, we must engage with it. So please, throughout this presentation, take care of yourselves, walk away, stand up, turn off your cameras. If you have to, log off. And while I am talking about the history of racism and how racism impacts homelessness, I also understand that each of us, every single person in this room today, has their own personal histories with racism, right? Like this is, as I said, this isn't some abstract thing. We each have our own experiences with this thing. So again, please take care of yourselves. As I said, my name is Joshua Bates, and I want to give a little bit about my background. Prior to joining the Joint Office, I worked specifically with youth and in community engagement. I led the My Brother's Keeper initiative for Columbus, Ohio. And also I engaged with young Black men, especially on all of their needs, all their material needs. I had conversations with their parents. I sat on couches. I was in schools. That really was like the passion of my life up to this point. And racism is still the foundational thing that I'm engaging with it professionally. And also, beyond all of that, all of those things, I am also a Black man first and foremost. Now, before jumping into this training, I also want to acknowledge that as I walk through this presentation on racism, which is the original sin of the United States, that we are still in the midst of all of this. The statistics that I'm going to be talking about when it comes to criminal justice and homelessness and other different systems, those aren't abstract numbers. Those aren't just numbers. Those are our community members. Those are our brothers. Those are our sisters. Those are ourselves. Those are our siblings. Those are our parents. They are our community. And also, when I talk about the history, when I talk about Jim Crow or slavery or the Indian Removal Act, those are our ancestors. Those are our grandparents. Those are our parents. Those are our lineages. Over a decade ago, when I was learning about redlining, I went to my grandfather pretty ignorantly, and I was like, I'm going to talk to you about this thing that I'm learning, redlining. And he stopped me and looked me dead in the eye, and he looked at me and he said, Joshua, I've lived that. That's me. That's my community. I saw its effects. And that's always stuck with me, that systemic racism, Jim Crow, lynchings, and other manifestations of violence, that wasn't that long ago. We're living amongst folks who have experienced those things. And when it comes to violence in our communities, we are living in a historical moment right now. We are experiencing those things. So over the last couple of days, folks keep reaching out to me and they're like, hey, are you good? Are you okay? And regardless of how I'm feeling, I always just am like, I'm good. I'm good. And I was reflecting on that again, another reflection moment before this presentation. And I thought back to, again, those years of working with kids, and no matter what they were experiencing, they would always tell me that they were good when I'd ask them how they were doing. I'm like, how are you doing in school? Oh, I'm good. How are you doing how are you with your parents? I'm good. No matter what was happening, they'd always say that they were good regardless of what was happening. And I almost feel like that response, that automatic response that so many people of color have when folks ask how they're doing, it's like almost a defense mechanism. But how can we be good when the murder of Black men is broadcasted far and wide without inhibition? And that murder is often happening at the hands of the police. How can we be good when our Asian siblings are being murdered in cold blood and those murders are framed as a person having a bad day? I have a daughter, a beautiful little daughter. She's only a year old. And when I've been looking at her recently, I can't help but think about the children of Dante Wright, of George Floyd, of Philando Castile, and countless others. And the fact that as they get older, as they start accessing the internet, they will inevitably encounter the terrible murder of their parents, that they will know the images, the last images of their parents' lives better than they will know the love from their parents, the hugs, the touch, their parents as people. So really, honestly, how can any of us be good right now or even okay when our brown and our Black and our indigenous people and communities in this country are persistently experiencing violence? And that is okay. It is okay to not be okay. And it is okay for all of us in this room today to not be okay. So today, I wanted to acknowledge all of those things before diving into this presentation, because that's the reality of this moment, right? That's the thing that I'm showing up with. That's the thing that many of us are showing up with. And processing those things is not the purpose of the next hour. That there are other places for that, but this is not the place for that to do today. So with your permission, I'm going to move into the rest of this presentation. Does that sound like a thing that I can do for everyone? All right. Thank you, Susie. The thumbs up means a lot to me. I thrive off of a call and response. Okay. So I'm going to now, let me move this over so I'm not looking off into, I'm looking directly at the screen. So as Alexandra said, we're going to be talking about systems of oppression today. And the term system of oppression help us better identify inequity by calling attention to the historical and organized patterns of mistreatment. And in the United States, systems of oppression, like systemic racism, are woven into the very foundation of American culture, society, and laws. Racism is the foundational system of oppression in the United States. So there's all these different overlapping systems of oppression that we're always navigating. Racism is one of them. Sexism is one of them. Ageism, classism, sexual orientation, ableism, all of those different types of oppressions overlap and are part of the very fabric of our country and impact the way that we engage with one another and the ways that systems engage with us. However, like I said, and also this happens in all of these different channels. It's from service providers to government employees to community members, program participants to elected officials. It's part of all of the different interactions that we have here as a society and as a community. However, as I said, racism is really the foundational oppression of this country. This country was founded on slavery. It was founded on the Indian Removal Act. And as those things were abolished or moved or changed, they manifest in different ways. In terms of Jim Crow laws that prevented Black folks and brown folks from accessing resources and other things. In terms of redlining, where communities where folks, federal assessors went into communities, looked at the racial composition of communities and said, oh, you know what? This is a low grade of Negro. This is a low grade of this race ethnic group, and created these entire entire communities that weren't allowed to have federal resources and loans and funding. And though you can actually track those areas and see how those communities are now disproportionately policed. Those communities are disproportionately underfunded and have a lack of resources. There's also racially restricted covenants where actually in the deeds of houses up to the present, it says that Black folks, brown folks, and other folks are not allowed to own this piece of property. And then there was the subprime mortgage crisis, which disproportionately impacted Black and brown communities. There's eminent domain where very oftentimes the federal government would come in and take away, would compensate, but oftentimes take away land in Black and brown communities. And then there's also gentrification that is happening. Yes.
I'm sorry to interrupt you. Your screen is blank right now. I think when you moved it to the other window, it's no longer visible.
Oh, thank you, Paul, for always letting me know when I'm messing up. Let me go back and let me share my screen. I appreciate that. Can you see it now?
Yeah, we got it.
Paul with the clutch play. And I was out here just talking to the void. And as I said, systemic racism is really the roots of this tree of the United States. It's really the roots of our culture, of our society. And it manifests in all of these different ways that outside of what I just listed. It manifests in microaggressions, day-to-day indignities that people of color experience. It manifests in tokenism and racist jokes and hate crimes and even the idea of colorblindness that racism doesn't exist. And the racialized violence that we are, like I said, that we're perpetually inundated with, in housing discrimination, in mass incarceration, in the school to prison pipeline, and finally in homelessness. We see racism being a part of all of our contemporary social systems and impacting us in tacit and overt ways in our day-to-day. So now I'm going to move into a history of racism in Oregon. And this is a very comprehensive slide. I'm not going to read everything on this slide. I really created it just to give you all a sense of how rooted Oregon is and our country is in the oppression of Black folks, Indigenous folks, and communities of color more broadly. So in the Oregon Constitution, there is this section, and it said, no free Negro or mulatto not residing in this state at the time of the adoption of this Constitution shall ever come, reside, or be within this state, or hold any real estate, or make any contract, or maintain any suit therein, and the Legislative Assembly shall provide by penal laws for the removal by public officers of all such free Negroes and mulattoes, and for their effectual exclusion from the state, and for the punishment of persons who shall bring them into the state or employ or harbor them therein. Basically saying that Black folks, you are not allowed in this state, and folks that harbor or bring those folks in, y'all will be punished. That is foundational to Oregon. And I found this quote about this, that Oregon is a useful case study for the rest of the nation because the only thing unique about Oregon is it was bold enough to write it down. The same policies, practices, and ideologies that shaped Oregon shaped the nation as a whole. And that's by public academic and luminary Walida Imarisha, excuse me, I sometimes start stuttering. So I'm going to go through these very full slides. So as you can see, from the very beginning of Oregon, Lewis and Clark's voyage of discovery asserted America's presence in the Indian country in the American West. And the U.S. Supreme Court later invoked the doctrine of discovery in 1806 for the acquisition of all that Indian land. And that is right here in Oregon and in the Northwest. And then also, right in 1844, there was acts to prohibit slavery and exclude Black and mulattoes from Oregon. It was passed. The infamous Lash Law that required that Blacks in Oregon, be they free or slave, be whipped twice a year until he or she shall quit the territory. Basically saying that that Black folks would be whipped for living here in Oregon. And you saw this trend, this racist and oppressive trend, continue to pop up throughout the history of Oregon. There was I'll go a little further ahead and say that Oregon adopted a law requiring all Blacks, Chinese, Hawaiians, and mulattoes residing in Oregon to pay an annual tax of $5, which was a lot back then. And this wasn't just happening to Black folks and indigenous folks. There was also violence toward Asian folks. Chinese immigrants were driven by mobs out of Oregon City, Mount Tabor, and Albina in the 1880s. Also, Oregon was one of the first places that had a boarding school that was meant to really indoctrinate indigenous kids into whiteness and eliminate their cultural heritage. The third boarding school in the United States was in Salem, and it was called Chemawa Indian Boarding School, and that happened in 1879. Also, there was a lynching here in Oregon in 1902. Alonzo Tucker, an African-American man, was hanged from a beam on the South Marshfield Bridge by a mob of armed white coal miners in Coos Bay, and he was accused of assaulting a white woman. So when we're talking about racism here in Oregon, it is important to remember this legacy. The KKK is also very important too. The KKK was established in Oregon in 1921, and by the mid-1920s, its membership was estimated between 14,000 and 20,000. And there was many sympathizers who were not official members. And these folks, they impacted policy, they impacted government, and they laced white supremacy within the very policies of Oregon. So I'm gonna have another slide. In 1923, the Oregon state legislature passed a number of restrictive laws. The Alien Land Law prevented first-generation Japanese Americans from owning or leasing land. The Oregon Business Restriction Law allowed cities to refuse business licenses to first-generation Japanese Americans. So once again, this isn't just happening to Black folks and indigenous folks. Also, anti-Asian sentiment and anti-immigrant sentiment and anti-Latino sentiment is built within the fabric of the history of Oregon. In 1935, Oregon law officially segregated Mexican students on the basis of being of Indian descent, and it made it clear to exempt white Mexicans who fair-skinned descendants of the Spaniards who do not have Indian blood. And this goes on to the present, right? You can see that a Vanport City was constructed in 1943 between Portland and the Columbia River. Southern Blacks were recruited in large numbers to work the shipyards, and at its peak, 100,000 people, 40% of whom were Black, lived in Vanport. But then in 1948, there was a terrible flood, and that flood left 39 people dead. And there was no response to that flood by Portland's housing authority to resettle all of those victims of segregation. And most displaced Blacks were actually forced to congregate in Albina, but many folks left Oregon. And as I said, I'm not going to read through all of these things. This is really for a reference, but I also wanted to know that this keeps going up to 1970s and 1980s and even to the present. In 1988, a 28-year-old Ethiopian student and father, Mulugeta Sarah, was fatally beaten in Portland by 3 racist skinheads. I was born in Oregon in 1986, and that's happened within my lifetime. And there are things that are happening right now, right, when it comes to police violence, when it comes to violence and gentrification and other dynamics against Black communities that we are still a part of and that have a direct relationship with these historical dynamics. So that's the history. That's the history of how we got to this place. Now I'm going to talk about a number of different outcomes on race, outcomes based on race here in this country. An Office of Homeless Services understands all of those things that we just talked about racism as being a driver of homelessness. Any effective response to homelessness must lead with racial equity and take into account racism across systems, racism within homeless service programs and institutions, and the impact of past and present racist policies. So really, when we look at homelessness, we understand that homelessness as a category is impacted by outcomes and racism in other systems. It is racism, like almost imagine this river being being across a person's life, like imagining it being a person's life and being across their life. And throughout that person's life, whether it be in healthcare, the healthcare they received as a child, the healthcare they received as a youth, the healthcare they're receiving now, or education, the ways that racism plays out in institutions and educational institutions, or in criminal justice with ways that communities of color are disproportionately policed and people of color are disproportionately all either incarcerated, sentenced, all of the different things in the criminal justice system, or in housing, the way, like I was just talking about redlining, or racially restricted covenants, or gentrification, or if we're talking about employment and implicit bias and racism in employment, or just having a name that sounds ethnic can actually prevent you from attaining employment. All of these different things impact outcomes when we in homelessness. So really, when we think about homelessness, we have to understand that it is the sum total of the experiences across these different institutions, and then also the homelessness system is rife also with racism. So I'm actually going to now go through a number of different statistics, some of them being in Multnomah County, some of them in Portland, some of them in Oregon, and some of them across the United States. Okay, so these are health outcomes here in Oregon. And hepatitis C is a curable disease. It's a curable disease. But in Oregon, as you can see, African Americans and American Indians and Alaska Natives die at a far greater rate from hepatitis C than their white or Asian counterparts. Latino and Latina communities are about even with white folks, and Asian folks are impacted or die at the lowest rates when it comes to hepatitis C. In regards to HIV diagnoses here in Oregon, African Americans have a far higher rate of diagnoses than any other category. However, Pacific Islanders and Latinos and Latinas have a rate that is over almost double that of their white counterparts. Going further into health outcomes, this was a particularly compelling statistic. One way to calculate the burden of early death is by measuring the number of years between a person's age at death and at a standard age at death. In 2015, African Americans and American Indians and Alaska Natives had a higher YPLL years of potential life lost compared to whites. Asians and Latinos had a lower YPLL compared to whites. African Americans and American Indians and Alaska Natives have the highest YPLL from unintentional injuries, homicide, and diabetes. And as you can see on this slide right here, you can see that African Americans and American Indians and Alaska Natives have a rate that's far greater than their white counterparts. All right, I'm going to go on to the next slide. Here are poverty rates here in Oregon based on race. As you can see, 28% of Black folks in Oregon are experiencing poverty. American Indians, Pacific Islanders, Latinx communities, and Asian communities all have greater rates of poverty in Oregon than their white counterparts. Here's childhood poverty. I thought this was also another, I mean, all these are compelling, but this one was especially striking. Children of color are more likely to live in poverty. 48% of Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander children in Oregon are living in poverty. 44% of Black children are living in poverty. 35% of Latino communities are living in poverty. 38% of American Indian and Alaska Native children are living in poverty. And as you can see, the only ethnic group or racial group that is at a smaller rate than the white community is the Asian community. However, even with all those kids experiencing poverty, you see outcomes here on the right side of this, that outcomes for white students in poverty are actually far greater than any of their community of color counterparts. So basically what that means is that even if you control for the poverty level of communities, meaning if like a white community or a white household has a similar poverty rate to an Asian household or a Black household or a Pacific Islander household, that kids do better when they're white than their people of color counterparts. So this isn't just education, it's also, and it's not just in poverty, it's also in housing. So the median income by household type here in Portland is reflected here on this slide. Black households make almost $30,000 per year compared to their white counterparts that make over $60,000 a year. Latinx households make a little over $40,000 a year, as do Native households. So on the bottom left and the bottom right are affordability based on jurisdiction here in Portland. And on the left side, the light color, as you can see, are places that are affordable for white communities, and the places that are dark are places that are unaffordable or not, where white households cannot afford. The picture on the right is for Black households. And what's really particularly disturbing about this picture is that there is not one place in the city of Portland that is affordable for the average Black household here in Portland. So when you're thinking about outcomes in homelessness, when you're thinking about people of color being disproportionately represented in homelessness here in Multnomah County and here in Portland, this is a crucial reason why, right? It's directly correlated to the affordability of our community. All right, here's criminal justice. This is kind of a confusing slide. I realized that after I made it, but I'm not good at making graphics, so I pulled these graphics from a report. These are different snapshots of disparities in the criminal justice system. On a one-day snapshot of the entire jail population, that's the top one. In Multnomah County on June 30th, 2019, people of color were far more likely than white adults to be incarcerated. You can see that on the right side of this slide, that white folks were there was a 1 to 6.2 ratio from white communities to black communities. There's a 1 to 3.2 ratio from white communities to Native American communities, and so on and so forth. In 2019, people of color were also more likely than white adults to be booked in jail. As you can see on the middle part of this slide, white folks are compared to black communities and Native American communities are far underrepresented. And then finally, on the bottom part of this slide, in 2018 and 2019, people of color were far more likely to have a case that resulted in conviction. As you can see, once again, if you compare the white community to the black community, especially, you can see the disproportionate outcomes in rates of conviction. All right, and then I'm going to get to this slide, and this terrible, terrible slide on police shootings that is especially pertinent right now. I mean, all this is pertinent right now, but this is especially something that's pertinent. So once again, white represents a 1 to something ratio. So in rates of fatal police shootings in this country from 2015 to 2020, for every white person that was killed, 2.5 essentially black folks were killed, and it's also I'm sorry, this is a hard slide to get through. Also, as you can see, the Native community, it's a 1 to 3 ratio, and the Hispanic community, it's about a 1.5 ratio. Now, when you go over to unarmed folks that were killed by the police, you can see it even goes up, right? It's a 1 to 3 ratio from white to black. It's a 1 to almost 4 ratio for white to Native, and it's a 1 to 1.5 or a little bit above 1.5 for the Hispanic and Latinx community. And now we're here at homelessness. As I said, I almost used that river to describe all of this, right? In homelessness here in Multnomah County, people of color are far more likely to experience homelessness than their representation in the general population. So the light color bar graph is their representation in the general population here in our community, and the dark color is their representation in homelessness. So people of color represent almost 30% of the population here in Multnomah County, and almost 40% of homelessness in Multnomah County. The black community, it's almost double, or it's over double their representation in the general population, and the American Indian and Alaska Native is over almost 5 times as much as their representation in the general population. And also, I think it's especially important to note that this doesn't take into account the different ways that homelessness manifests in other communities, such as being doubled up, such as living with relatives, and so on and so forth, that are also parts of homelessness, but are not represented here on this slide. Okay, and then we can get to COVID-19. These are from very early in the pandemic, but here, this is parts of this are from Oregon and parts of this are from the United States. Black mortality from COVID-19 was 3.57 times higher than white mortality. Navajo Nation had a higher per capita infection rate at one point than anywhere in the country or any state. 33% of Oregon's COVID-19 cases were in the Latinx community, despite being only 13% of the population. Xenophobia and racialized hatred was directed and continues to be directed toward folks of Asian descent. People of color early in the pandemic, when there was lockdowns, were disproportionately cited and arrested for breaking social distancing. And people of color were and still are disproportionately essential workers. So even in things like COVID-19 that impacted the entire country, there were disproportionate outcomes when it came to people of color. So that was a lot, right? So there's some general takeaways. Our society is infused with systems of oppression, which causes negative outcomes for people of color across systems, across every single social system. You will see disproportionate outcomes when it comes to people of color. Systemic racism is foundational to our society and to Oregon, and leads to disproportionate outcomes throughout history and across systems, both nationally and locally. And we must lead with race, lead with racial equity to combat these disparities and legacies. So there's an activity that I have built in. I know that I think I still have about 40 minutes, so we can actually do this activity. And please feel free to not participate. And then please also remember to be trauma informed. To Mia's point, everything that we do here should be trauma informed. Right about now, I just gave you a ton of information. I gave you a ton of context. I gave you like almost too much, right? And I'm sure that some of it was new and some of it you hadn't heard before. Please write about what you needed from your parents, your families, your loved ones, your teachers, and others to teach you about how race works in this world, your place in this system, and how you should use your positionality to eliminate racism. Like, what do you need or did you need to do this work? And spend about 5 minutes just journaling or writing or thinking about this, and then we can come back. How does that sound, Alexandra? Okay. So 5 minutes, we'll come back at 1:25. Okay, so so please remember, like trauma informed is really important. Think about other folks' experiences. Would one or two folks like to share what they wrote, or yeah, would anyone like to share?
I can share.
Yeah, please do.
My mother at 80, well, she's 89, and she was a first Black homecoming queen at college. So I never needed her to tell me anything about race. But when I got in high school, that's when I started seeing it, the racism and stuff. So I always was a person who stood up for me and my rights. And now, even so, right now, as far as using my positionality to eliminate racism, I have taken my past experiences and not only my voice, but my actions to push for change. Because see, everyone are not able to fight or defend to fight for themselves, or even just to be respected for me as a Black person. I engage. I'm not afraid to approach you. I don't have a problem in voicing how I feel, what I feel, or if a situation was done to me, I'm going to talk to you. All you can say is I'm fine, but I'm gonna still let you know how I feel and how I was treated. By the grace of God, I'm gonna say it that way, is that people that I have engaged with has backed me and supported me, and has made it easier and open for other people to approach them as well. But just in case they can't, I can.
Daniel, thank you so much for that very profound story, or your story, right? Like how you actually had folks be able to that taught you about racism, and that when you started engaging with it, you pushed back against it because you had those tools to push back against it. Exactly. And then also you highlighted something really important too, is just how folks stepped in and supported you and were essentially allies. And that's a really, really crucial part of this anti-racist work, right? Is thinking about how you can ally and support your Black and Brown and Indigenous and people of color counterparts.
Yeah, exactly.
Thank you so much, Danielle. Is there anyone else that would like to share?
Yeah, I would like to say something.
Please do, hop in.
I'm sorry, the young lady that was there, she could go first. I can wait.
Okay.
Oh, thank you. So I experienced, or my parents started talking to me, or acknowledging, I guess, talks about racism within the U.S. When I came to Oregon to go to Portland State University for my undergrad. My childhood, I was raised overseas, and I lived in Madagascar. So for me, being African and everybody around me was the same color as me, so I didn't really get exposed to racism until I came here. And education was the the thing that my parents taught me to gain or to partake in my life, because throughout history, we know that education was one of the ways that we weren't allowed to express our voices, or that brought down a lot of the minority groups within the country or the community that you lived in. And when I was at Portland, both of my parents happened to be white, because I was adopted at a young age. And so as I processed throughout my life, I was like, oh, I've been very sheltered, even though I'm Black. Everybody, when they see me, they're like, oh, she's Black. And they have all these stereotypes about what a Black person is and everything. But then when I speak, they're like, oh, wait, her speech is very different compared to me. And when I went to Portland State, both sides, the white and Blacks, were like, wait, you're not part of our group. And I'm like, well, first of all, I'm Black. I perceive Black. And so education was the way to, for me to escape that whole racism or stereotypes, and then use my voice to fight for those who are voiceless. And then also to be part of the network of the business world, because I think with education, you're seen as having a little bit of power in what you want, in what you want to let everybody be aware of. So I think education was one tool for me to be like, okay, I can use this in order to help those who are not able to help. And Nelson Mandela is someone that I really appreciate. He has a quote. I'm not sure what the whole quote is, but the fact that education is the passport to the world. And I really appreciated my parents in teaching me the importance of education and using my voice that way.
Thank you so much for that very profound story, right? Like where you were talking about how in Madagascar, you weren't a part of the same sort of system of racism as the United States. And when you came here, you were suddenly dropped into it. And you almost had to figure out like what the heck was going on. And it really sounds like through education, you were able to do that. But also through education, you're also empowering yourself to be able to push back against racism and support folks that maybe don't have that, that maybe like you said, voiceless, but maybe just don't have the platform to be able to speak to to have their voice heard. And I think that also something that you really highlighted that's super important is how important it is to educate yourselves on the history of racism in this country, right? Because the things that we see now, when it comes to homelessness, when it comes to education, when it comes to our entire society, those are rooted in that history, and that history is not often taught to us. So it's really, really crucial. I think education is a very crucial point. So we have time for one more. Please, Trish, if I'm not saying your name correctly, please let me know.
Yeah, it's Trish. I just wanted to touch briefly on, so my mom's a Vanport survivor. Quite a few of my family members are Vanport survivors. And just historically, my family is tied to Portland in a way. Like my mom was the first African-American female police officer and the first of the 5 women in the city of Portland. And so racism for us was introduced at a very, very young age. Because my mom just went through it. She just recently had a scholarship put in her name at PCC so that the next wave of law enforcement officers could have a scholarship to help pay their way through college. My dad's a blues musician, but he's from Bonita, Louisiana. So, racism ran really deep, and he came here when he was 15. So just how intricate my family is in the community in seeing racism at a really young age. And for so long, I was like, I'll be 53 this year. And it's a lot. It's a lot. I was born in 1968. So I always say I was born the year of the King. So, Martin Luther King, his being born in that year just means a lot to me. And it just makes me that activist that I am.
Well, thank you so much for sharing all of that, right? Like all the things that I was talking about, that's like your history, that's part of your family, right? And I think that that's such an important frame to have, is that to know that you were a part of this stuff, and that folks in this room today are part of these dynamics that we're talking about. And that even right now, when we look back 20 years from now and look back at this year, we're going to remember this trial that we're all watching, right? We're going to remember the ways that police violence happened against young Black folks and young folks of color. We're going to remember this terrible, terrible, terrible massacre that happened in Atlanta when it comes to the Asian community. We're going to remember these things, and we're a part of that history. So I really, really do appreciate you orienting us around your history, and like that these things aren't abstract that we're talking about. These are things that are a part of the people that are here in this room. So thank you so much, everyone, for sharing and being vulnerable and coming to this, coming like sharing yourselves and sharing your story. It takes bravery to be able to do that, because by sharing your story, you're really sharing a part of yourself, and you're allowing us to all engage with that. So thank you. All right, I'm going to go through the last couple of slides. Actually, there's more than a couple, but I'm going to move through the last parts of this presentation, and then there'll be a little time for questions, and then we'll move into the panel. So this is a really important takeaway, right? That while we were talking about all these systems and all these statistics, it takes individual actors to uphold these systems. When we talk about 14,000 members of the KKK here in Oregon, those were individuals, right? Those were individuals that chose to system, chose to perpetuate racism. But we also have the ability to reject racism. We have agency and we have power. So I'm going to talk about how systems of oppression, all of these different things, inform perceptions. So this is from Hurricane Katrina, and my apologies for not having a trigger warning before this slide. And this is the difference in the ways that people were framed or understood to be when they were experiencing Katrina. The top part says, a young man walks through chest-deep floodwater after looting a grocery store in New Orleans on Tuesday, August 30th, 2005. On the bottom, people doing the exact same thing. So it says, 2 residents wade through chest-deep water after finding bread and soda from a local grocery store after Hurricane Katrina comes through the area in New Orleans. So as you can see, systems of oppression inform the ways that we understand one another and understand ourselves. Race and perceptions of competence. So basically what was done on with this part in this study is that the exact same writing sample and the exact same resume was sent out to different law firms. One of them was identified to being an African American male, and one of them was identified to be a Caucasian male. And then they were asked to review those writing samples for different errors. So for the white male, or the Caucasian male, 2.9 of the 7 errors that were intentionally put in that writing sample were found on average, and 5.8 of the 7 spelling errors were found for the African American, the one that was identified to be African American. For technical errors, there's a similar disparity: 4.9 for the African American male versus 4.1 for the Caucasian male. For technical errors, once again, you see that disparity: 3.9 for the African American male versus the 3.2 for the Caucasian male. Then they were asked to rate these in terms of competence. On average, the African American male was rated a 3.2 out of 5 versus the Caucasian male, and these are the exact same writing samples, the exact same resumes, was rated 4.1 out of 5. And then these are some of the qualitative comments. For the African American Thomas Meyer, it was said that this person needs lots of work, can't believe he went to NYU, average at best. For the Caucasian Thomas Meyer, these were some of the quotes: generally a good writer, but needs work on, has potential, good analytical skills. So as you can see, race informs even the framing of these errors, the framing of if it's either asset-based or deficit-based, right? It informs the ways of the perceptions of competence. So we can read these as that partners expected more errors and lower quality in the memo of African American male, or partners expected fewer errors and higher quality in the memo written by the Caucasian male. So basically, the Caucasian male was given the benefit of the doubt, while the African American male was not given the benefit of the doubt and was actually scrutinized. And you can see stuff like this manifest in all sorts of ways, right? Like who's followed in convenience stores, who's followed in grocery stores. Even one time, I'll give you a little story from myself. I was walking out of a grocery store with my white friend, and we had both just bought apples. I mean, I don't know. Actually, I'm eating an apple right now, actually, for lunch. I just guess I love apples. And when we were walking out of nowhere, these two, not security guards, they were like worker, I don't know what they were, maybe loss prevention specialists, hopped down and said, "Sir, we need to see your receipt." And right in front of me was my white friend who was eating an apple as well. And I said, "Why didn't you look at her receipt?" And they were like, "Well, we didn't see her receipt, but we didn't see her eating the apple. We saw you eating the apple." And I'm like, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And that's a manifestation of this dynamic too. But also beyond all of that, this comes in with undue traffic stops. This comes in perceptions of danger. And as you saw in Minnesota, it comes with a young black male being stopped because of a air freshener that was in his mirror. So this also pops up in the healthcare industry as well. This was a study that was done with I think medical students at the University of Virginia, and that black. Actually, I think that the next slide is nope. This is this slide. Black Americans are systematically undertreated for pain relative to white Americans. That is basically the national trend, is that black Americans are systematically undertreated for pain. There is a strong correlation between people who believe that there are biological differences between races and underreporting of pain for black patients. So there is this terrible stereotype about thick skin, and it actually is endemic when it comes to the medical field, and it shows up in treatment. And I don't know if all of y'all know about Serena Williams's her birth process, but she almost died in childbirth, regardless of the fact that she was telling her doctors, and she is one of the most prominent black women in the world. She was telling her doctors something was wrong, and they would not listen to her. They thought that she was being hysterical, or it was just normal. And she, I think, was an hour away from dying. And that trend, when it comes to black women dying disproportionately during childbirth, that is a national trend. In New York City, I believe black women are 11 times more likely to die during childbirth than their white counterparts. And also black children are much more likely to die during or black babies are much more likely to die during childbirth than their white counterparts. Half of white students and residents at the University of Virginia endorse this belief that black patients feel less pain. And it also comes into play when it comes to neighborhoods. So this is actually what happened in this study. Is the exact same neighborhoods were shown to a group of different people, and basically they either had black folks in the pictures or white folks, and the racial composition of a neighborhood, like the difference in regards to who was standing in front of different houses in the neighborhood. People had a lower assessment of housing costs in the black community, a lower assessment of safety in the black community, a lower assessment of school quality, a lower assessment of property upkeep, and a lower assessment of future property values. So regardless of the fact that it was the exact same people or exact same community and just different people based on race, it impacted the assessment of all of those different things. For white participants, simply black residents in a neighborhood elicited more negative evaluations of the neighborhood conditions, even when all aspects except race were comparable between neighborhoods. People unconsciously use race as a proxy for evaluating neighborhood risk. So why am I talking about all of these different things when it comes to interpersonal? I think that it's important to understand the multiple layers of oppression, right? That it shows up in our history, that it shows up in our systems, and that also it shows up in our individual understandings of one another. So when we're thinking about de-escalation, we're thinking about engaging with people who are elevated or people that are coming in and we're serving. It is important to look at ourselves in the mirror and understand the ways that we are embodying systems of oppression when we're engaging with our clients and we're engaging with our participants. It's important to be able to take a step back, to assess yourself and assess how you are showing up when it comes to people that are elevated and people that we are serving. And that's the reason that I'm I'm summarizing all the different ways that racism is a part of the ways that we understand one another, because if we acknowledge it, as I said on that very first slide, we can do something about it. Okay. So the takeaway from this part is systems of oppression inform our understandings of people, places, and societal phenomena. These understandings may cause us to make decisions that are detrimental to our organizations and ourselves. And the collective bias of individual actors lead to systemic outcomes. Collectively, right, when we collectively condone racism or decide to actively perpetuate racism, we get things like racially restricted covenants. We get things like redlining. We get things like the displacement of indigenous folks. We get things like that. But it also collectively, through collectively being anti-racist and rejecting racism and fighting racism, we can move against it. And the reason I say decisions that are detrimental to our organizations and ourselves is that we don't want to negatively impact our participants. We don't want to negatively treat people differently. What we want to do is we want to serve folks, but in order to correctly serve folks, we must have a lens or an eye towards systemic oppression and the ways that we embody it and perpetuate it. Okay, so what can we do? I'm going to go through a couple of quick slides on what we can do, and then I'm going to open it up for questions. We have about 17 minutes left. So it's important to know your biases. Like I said, be introspective. Think about like the things that you're inhabiting and perpetuating. Also take time before acting. I'm sure that the other the other presenters really talked about all the different smaller mechanisms to engage with other folks. Sorry, my daughter's crying in the background, and now it's starting to throw me off. Also, you have to understand too, question objectivity. What you're seeing before you, that is not an objective thing. Your biases are impacting the way that you see any sort of interpersonal situation. And be intentional about identifying those moments where you are most susceptible to implicit bias. So it's like when you're stressed, when you have a lot of different things going on, be intentional about thinking about all of how you're defaulting to those biases because you don't have time to think about them. Also, interrupt biases. Identify the emergence of bias. Decide to address the situation. I mean, many of y'all, I'm sure many of y'all have seen biases play out in decision-making. Biases show up in interpersonal relationships, in all sorts of different things, show up and support, and to someone's point earlier, interrupt and be an ally. Decide to speak out against oppression and racism, and also follow up with the folks that are impacted by it. Also, utilize data. As I showed you, data is a powerful thing when we use it correctly, right? We can, like, through understanding the complexity of this problem through data, we can identify key points and metrics to engage with and shift. We need to log data, set clear goals, track progress, and analyze trends. But I think it's also really important that data is one side of a very complex puzzle. And the other part of that is that folks' lived experiences, the stories that folks shared with you today, the stories that folks have, those are just as important as any data. And we need to believe folks when they're talking to us about systems of oppression. And also, we need to move toward equity. Really, equity is what we see on the bottom, not the top. Equality is like, hey, all of us, we all get the same bike regardless of how tall we are, our ability status, or our age. And equity is really about providing what it is that folks need, right? The different services, the different responses, the different treatments that folks need. And if we're understanding to lead with race, first and foremost, with any equity consideration, we have to consider the ways that systemic racism is showing up, the other way is that it's impacting individuals, it's impacting communities, and we need to provide responses for systemic racism. Okay, and then finally, this is the socio-ecological model, and I think this is just kind of an important dynamic or an important model to uplift, because it kind of gets to the different ways that racism plays out, or any systemic oppression plays out in a society. So you can see that on that, and I've talked about a lot of these different things, right? I've talked about society-wide trends, I've talked about community trends, I've talked about individual trends, and really you can all see that in all of these different that the individual is placed within the interpersonal, that is placed within the organizational, and so on and so forth. And the sociological models of health behavior emphasize the environmental policy context of behavior while incorporating social and psychological influences. Ecological models lead to the explicit consideration of multiple levels of influence, thereby guiding the development of more comprehensive interventions. That's why it's important to have things like equity training that are getting to us as individuals, right? Like, that's important. But it's also important to engage with our elected officials about unequitable policies. It's important to think about, hey, the organization that I'm a part of has this policy that is impacting people of color disproportionately and negatively. We got to do something about that. It shows that there are multiple layers to to racism and to the response to racism. So when we're thinking about responses to eliminating racism, you need to think about these different levels. So these are some examples of the society-wide equity work. You know, I have equity training, or not society-wide, equity work in the socio-ecological model. As you see on the individual level, I have equity trainings. On the interpersonal, I have affinity groups, things that we have at the joint office. On organizational, here in the county, we have the Workforce Equity Strategic Plan to impact equity across the entire organization. And on a community level, we have the SUN system. On the public policy level, we have the Civil Rights Act of 1964, amongst many others. And then on a society-wide thing, what we're seeing now and what we've seen for the last year are racial justice protests. And all of those things are a part of eliminating racism here in different levels of our society. So, since I began with a quote, I'm gonna end with a quote. Ours is not the struggle of one day, 1 week, or 1 year. Ours is not the struggle of one judicial appointment or presidential term. Ours is the struggle of a lifetime, or maybe even many lifetimes. And each one of us in every generation must do our part. When we looked at the history of racism and all of the terrible things that were happening throughout the history of our country and the history of our state and the history of our community, there were folks that were fighting against those things, folks that were trying to change things, and folks that did change things. And we are part of that fight. So right now, today, we all have the option to continue to perpetuate racism, or we reject racism and push back against racism. And it's really important that you have to know that this fight will likely last our entire lifetime. And this fight has lasted many of our family members, many of our community members, their entire lifetimes. Thank you very much for your time today. I really appreciate the opportunity to present to all of you. Do any of you have any questions or anything that you would like to uplift? Remember, trauma informed is very important. We have 10 more minutes or so, so please feel free to ask any questions, hop in, comments, all of those things are appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you, Josh. That's awesome. Do folks have questions for Josh?
Okay, any questions? Hey, I guess I was super clear. That's abnormal. Whoa. Okay. Comments, questions, thoughts? All right, y'all. I usually give it 5 seconds of awkward silence, and then I'm on to the next thing because, you know. Oh, all right. Go ahead. Hop in. Sefia, did I pronounce your name correctly? Yeah, Sefia, hop in. Go ahead. Go for it. I can't hear you.
Yes. So with the homelessness in Portland increasing, especially with like the COVID pandemic, how do you see a lot of increase within the Black population, or is it like a mix of everybody?
So there's been anecdotes, and the anecdotes are that we're seeing far greater rates in communities of color. Those anecdotes haven't been backed up by any study or any report, right? I don't believe. So we certainly know that COVID-19 has disproportionately impacted the earnings and the economics in Black communities and brown communities and indigenous communities. So we could it's likely that we are going to see an influx in homelessness for communities of color because of that. And as I said, many folks are saying those things, and it's important to hold those stories as true and those things as true. So I would say, based on our community members and the things I've been hearing, absolutely yes, but I can't point you to any study or anything for that. Thank you for the question. Any other questions?